You know, usually when we talk about some kind of massive historical disaster, there is this expectation of precision in the failure.
Oh, absolutely.
Like it's like looking at a modern engineering report, right? You look at a bridge collapse, and the inspector points to I don't know, a single rusted rivet or a stress fracture in a support beam, and they say, "There it is. That right there is exactly where the math failed."
Right, right. Because it's binary. I mean, we instinctively look for that exact moment the structure gave way.
Yeah.
The singular variable that shifted the equation from, stable to catastrophic.
Broken or not broken, it's clean, it's understandable, and honestly, it's deeply comforting to think about it that way.
It is comforting
Yeah.
because we like things to be visible.
Hmm.
We like events to be neatly categorized,
Mm.
especially when we're looking back at military history. We want to find the one bad tactical decision on the battlefield,
Yeah, exactly.
the one misread map, or the one delayed messenger.
Yeah. But then you step into the world of the Great Sioux War, specifically this incredibly dense period from the winter of 1875 into the summer of 1876, which you actually provided in your notes for us today.
Which are fantastic notes, by the way.
Incredible. So detailed. But the moment you dive into these sources you sent us, that pristine engineering report is it's entirely useless. We are looking at a military and political landscape that is, well, it's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Because there isn't a single rusted rivet here. I mean, the failure wasn't just on the battlefield. The failure was systemic. It was baked into the very architecture of how the United States government was operating at that exact moment in time.
Which is why, for this deep dive, your mission is to step straight into that mud with us. We are looking really closely at the notes you provided on the political and military machinery behind the Great Sioux War. And we are focusing strictly on the operations during that specific winter, right? 1875 to 1876. The War Department's strategy under the Grant administration, and the roles of commanders like Philip Sheridan and Alfred Terry.
And what is genuinely fascinating here, and I think what your sources lay out so clearly, is that to understand the bloodshed on the battlefield, you first have to completely understand the boardroom.
That is the ultimate irony we're going to tease out today.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at how a massive, highly structured bureaucratic machine operating out of Washington, D.C.,
Right.
combined with this inexplicably hands-off management style from a military headquarters in Chicago, ultimately set the stage for one of the most infamous military disasters in American history.
The fall of Custer.
Exactly, the fall of Custer.
It's a story built entirely on contrasts, really. You have the pristine, heavily ornamented administrative offices of Washington, D.C., where policies are drafted on thick parchment by men in warm suits. And then you have the brutal, unpredictable, just freezing reality of the Great Plains. And the tension between those two environments, and the sheer inability of the former to understand the latter, is exactly what caused the whole system to break down.
You literally have men sitting in steam-heated rooms making life-or-death operational decisions for men freezing in the snow 1,000 miles away.
Right.
So let's get into the architecture of this machine. Because before we can even begin to explore how the military carried out their campaign on the plains, we need to understand exactly who was pulling the levers of power.
We need to look at the War Department's hierarchy under President Ulysses S. Grant.
Yeah, it's like a massive steam locomotive. You have the boiler room, you have the conductors, and you have the tracks. And we really need to know who is sitting in the conductor's chair.
Well, if we start at the very top of the civilian leadership, you have the Secretary of War. And this position reported directly to President Grant.
Okay.
And for nearly 8 years, right up until the climax of this story, that position was held by a man named William W. Belknap.
8 years. Which, in the context of a 19th century presidential cabinet, especially under Grant, whose administration was famously turbulent, right? 8 years is an eternity.
Well, it's a dynasty in political terms.
So Belknap must have wielded just an unbelievable amount of influence over how the Western frontier was managed day to day.
He wielded near absolute administrative authority over the Army's frontier footprint. The Secretary of War held a lot of significant powers, but according to your notes, one of the most crucial and ultimately destructive powers was his authority to approve and license military trading posts.
Okay, wait, stop right there and explain the mechanics of this, because I think, when a lot of people picture a trading post, they picture a quaint little log cabin selling flour and coffee.
Like a little general store on the prairie.
Exactly. But these were essentially massive government-sanctioned monopolies, weren't they?
They were absolute monopolies. These post-trader ships were the economic lifelines on the frontier. I mean, think about it. If you were a soldier stationed at a remote fort in the Dakota Territory, you couldn't just walk into town to buy supplies.
Because there is no town.
Exactly. There's nothing but grass and snow for hundreds of miles. So you relied entirely on the post-trader for anything beyond your basic, often very meager army issue.
Right, like what?
Tobacco, fresh food, better clothing, writing supplies, everything came through the trader. And crucially, they also held a monopoly on trading with the local Native American tribes.
Wow.
So whoever controlled these trading posts controlled a massive, captive economic market.
So, okay, if I am the Secretary of War and I hold the sole power to decide who gets these incredibly lucrative monopoly licenses, I mean, that is a recipe for immense political patronage. Or, to put it less politely, massive corruption.
Which is exactly what the sources detail. Belknap's 8-year tenure came to a crashing halt due to a highly organized post-tradership kickback scandal.
Kickbacks, of course.
Essentially, individuals were paying exorbitant bribes to Belknap and his associates to secure these trading licenses. They would then turn around and gouge the soldiers and the Native Americans with wildly inflated prices to recoup the cost of the bribe and line their own pockets.
It's staggering when you think about the human cost of that paperwork. I mean, you've got a soldier freezing in Montana, paying triple for a warm blanket just so a bureaucrat in Washington can skim off the top.
It bred deep, deep resentment, and it fundamentally compromised the integrity of the frontier supply chain. The timing of the fallout is the critical piece here.
Right.
Belknap was suddenly forced to resign and was formally impeached by the House of Representatives in March 1876.
March of 1876. I mean, let's just put a massive red circle around that date.
Seriously.
Because as your notes show, March of 1876 is exactly when the military operations against the Sioux are supposedly kicking into high gear.
Yeah.
The timing is almost too cinematic to be real. The top civilian head of the military is impeached for corruption at the exact moment the troops he is supposed to be supplying are mobilizing for a major war.
It completely destabilized the apex of the hierarchy. The War Department was suddenly headless during a crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, following Belknap's rapid resignation, the position of Secretary of War was briefly held by Alphonso Taft.
Okay.
And then it turned over again to J.D. Cameron during the summer of 1876. So, right during the logistical climax of this massive military campaign, the Secretary of War's office is basically functioning as a revolving door.
Okay, so the civilian leadership is in total chaos. But below the Secretary of War, there's this entire entrenched administrative apparatus in Washington, D.C., right? Like the specialized bureaus.
Yes.
Even if the secretary is changing every few months, the paperwork factory is still running.
The bureaucracy kept grinding forward, absolutely.
All right.
The War Department was attempting to balance centralized administrative control in Washington with the vast, really unwieldy geographic reality of the Western frontier.
Right.
So in Washington, you had various specialized bureaus handling the mechanics of the Army. For instance, you had the Adjutant General's office, headed by E.D. Townsend.
Okay, what did they do?
This was the nervous system of the Army. They handled all the official correspondence, the deployment orders, the muster rolls, the official records.
So every single piece of official communication has to flow through Townsend's office?
Precisely. Then you had the Quartermaster General. Their mandate was the physical reality of the Army. Logistics, supply chains, transportation, the procurement of horses and mules. And, rather ominously given the subject matter, the quartermaster was also responsible for the construction and maintenance of national cemeteries.
Wait, really? We handle your beans, your bullets, your mules, and your burials.
Yeah.
That is a spectacularly grim portfolio.
It was a stark, bureaucratic reminder of the ultimate cost of doing the government's business, honestly. And finally, you had the Chief of Engineers managing military construction, mapping the frontier, building fortifications, overseeing public buildings. So that was the administrative side in D.C., the men managing the money, the maps, and the supplies. But then you have the actual uniformed military command structure.
Right, the guy's actually in uniform. And at the absolute top of that hierarchy, operating out of the National Army headquarters, is the General of the Army, William T. Sherman.
Yes.
But Sherman, who's famous for his march to the sea in the Civil War, he isn't micromanaging the Western frontier from his desk in Washington, is he? I mean, he delegates the map.
He had to. I mean, because of the sheer incomprehensible vastness of the expanding nation, the Army was divided geographically into massive divisions.
Okay.
The most significant division during Grant's presidency, and the one that encompasses the entirety of our deep dive today, was the Military Division of the Missouri.
And this is where a pivotal character enters the stage, right? Lieutenant General Philip H. Sheridan.
Yes. Sheridan commanded the Military Division of the Missouri from his headquarters located in Chicago.
In Chicago.
In Chicago.
Yeah.
And his jurisdiction was geographically staggering. It encompassed almost the entire Great Plains region, stretching all the way from the Mississippi River west to the Rocky Mountains and from the Canadian border down to the Texas Panhandle.
Let me make sure I'm picturing this right. We aren't talking about a modern military with instant satellite communication and encrypted radios.
Not at all.
We are talking about 1876. Sheridan is sitting in a brick building in Chicago trying to manage a territory the size of Western Europe using telegraph lines that only go so far. And after that, he's relying on guys riding horses for days just to deliver a piece of paper.
It's an extreme communication bottleneck. And because the territory is so inconceivably large, Sheridan has to further subdivide his division into regional departments to have any hope of tactical control.
And the sources highlight two critical departments under Sheridan that come into play for this specific winter and spring campaign: the Department of Dakota and the Department of the Platte.
Yeah, exactly. The Department of Dakota was commanded by Brigadier General Alfred Terry, and he was headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota.
St. Paul, okay.
His territory covered the northern tier. So present-day Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana.
And Terry's department is vital because it includes Fort Abraham Lincoln, which is the home base for the 7th Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer.
Correct. And then directly to the south of Terry's region, you have the Department of the Platte.
Okay.
This was commanded by Brigadier General George Crook, with his headquarters situated in Omaha, Nebraska. His territory covered Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Utah.
Okay, so let's look at this whole machine from a bird's eye view. You have President Grant and a corrupt, soon-to-be-impeached Secretary of War in Washington, D.C.
Yep.
You have General Sherman, also in Washington. You have Sheridan in Chicago. Terry is in St. Paul. Crook is in Omaha. And they're all trying to coordinate complex military actions against highly mobile, nomadic Native American bands across the trackless Great Plains.
It's a lot of moving parts.
You can immediately see the inherent friction here. I mean, it's like a massive corporate org chart. The CEO and the board are in Washington dealing with scandals. The regional VP Sheridan is sitting in a high-rise in Chicago managing via telegraph, and the branch managers, Terry and Crook, are out in the freezing field trying to make it work. How do you manage a fluid, dynamic, fast-moving situation on the ground when the decision-makers are hundreds or thousands of miles away?
You don't manage it well. I mean, it is a logistical and communicational nightmare. You have a system designed on paper for centralized control, but the center is embroiled in an impeachment trial, and the regional managers are separated from their field commanders by literally weeks of travel time.
Wow.
So you have this massive, cumbersome, distracted bureaucratic engine. But here is where the notes get really interesting.
Okay.
This machine, with all its bureaus and departments and telegraphs, was essentially idling in the fall of 1875. It needed a specific target. It needed a green light. And that catalyst was provided by a very specific, highly orchestrated political meeting in November of 1875.
Ah, right. This brings us directly to the political origin point of the Great Sioux War. On November 3rd, 1875, President Grant held a quiet but profoundly consequential meeting at the White House.
Let's look closely at the guest list for this meeting. Because if you want to know what a government is planning, you look at who they put in the room.
Exactly. And according to the notes you sent, you have President Grant, you have Secretary of War Belknap, who is still a few months away from his impeachment, you have the Secretary of the Interior, Zachariah Chandler, and you have Generals Sheridan and Crook, brought in all the way from Chicago and Omaha.
Right.
You have the ultimate heads of the military apparatus and the heads of internal civilian policy sitting at the same table.
And their motivation for calling this meeting is laid out explicitly in the administrative records you provided. The situation was driven by the Black Hills Gold Rush.
Right, the gold.
The Black Hills were recognized as unceded Indian territory by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. However, gold had been discovered, and white miners were flooding into the region illegally.
And we have to be very strict here about what the sources tell us regarding the administration's motives. They didn't call this meeting to figure out how to enforce the treaty and keep the miners out.
No.
They called the meeting to figure out how to get the Native Americans out.
Exactly. The sources explicitly state that based in part on a report by Indian Inspector E.C. Watkins, which characterized Sitting Bull's band and others as wild and hostile, the administration actively contrived a war.
Contrived a war.
The stated objective was to force these bands out of their unceded hunting grounds, specifically to open the Black Hills to white miners in economic expansion.
It's a calculated boardroom decision. They look at the map, they look at the gold, they look at the treaty, and they decide the treaty has to go.
Yeah.
But they need a procedural mechanism to make it happen, right? They can't just declare war without a pretext.
Which is why they engineered the ultimatum. Following this meeting, the administration issued a strict, sweeping directive. All Indians living off the reservations in the unceded territories must report to their respective government agencies by January 31st, 1876.
Or what?
Or they would officially be classified as hostile and subjected to military force.
Okay, wait. Lover, pause and really look at the mechanics of this demand. Because this is where the boardroom disconnects completely from reality. They issue a deadline of January 31st.
Yes.
We are talking about the dead of winter in the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Montana. How could any administration, looking at the logistical reality, realistically expect entire nomadic bands? And we are talking about thousands of people, families, elders, pregnant women, young children, dragging all their tippies, possessions, and thousands of ponies to pack up and travel hundreds of miles through a Great Plains blizzard.
It's wild to even think about.
Was compliance ever actually the goal here?
That is the pivotal question. And when you look at how bureaucracies function, the answer strongly points to no. That impossible January deadline was not a genuine request for relocation. It was a highly effective procedural tripwire. The administration, particularly the military men in that room like Sheridan, fully understood the weather conditions on the plains. They knew a mass migration of families in January was a physical impossibility.
So they're setting a test they know the other side will fail purely to generate the paperwork required to authorize force.
Precisely. It was a mechanism to legally justify pre-planned military action. They needed a trigger to deploy the army into the Black Hills without looking like the initial aggressor on paper.
And what happens mechanically when that January 31st deadline inevitably passes without compliance?
The bureaucratic gears shift. The matter is officially transferred from the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior, which handled Indian agencies, treaties, and civilian policy, directly to the War Department.
It is literally a folder of paperwork moving from one mahogany desk in Washington to another mahogany desk down the hall. And in that exact transition, a policy dispute becomes a shooting war.
The Interior Department effectively washes its hands of the problem. They issue a statement saying, "We issued the order. They did not comply. Over to you, General Sherman." And Sherman turns around and says, "Over to you, General Sheridan."
And Sheridan, sitting in his brick headquarters in Chicago, looks at this mandate. The January 31st deadline has just passed. It is February. It is the absolute dead of winter.
Yep.
Now, if I am looking at a map of Montana in February, I am saying, great, we have our authorization. Let's start stockpiling beans and bullets, and we will launch the campaign when the snow melts in May.
Right.
But that is not what Sheridan does.
No, it isn't. And to understand why, we have to delve into Sheridan's specific strategic mindset. As your sources note, Sheridan commanded a vast apparatus.
Yeah.
4 military districts, approximately 6,000 military personnel, and 27 separate forts and camps scattered across the frontier.
A massive force.
And crucially, he had ultimate overriding authority over this specific operation because the Native American bands they were targeting moved fluidly across the invisible boundaries of both Terry's Department of Dakota and Crook's Department of the Platte.
Oh, I see.
Sheridan was the only man with a geographic jurisdiction to orchestrate the whole theater.
So he has the power and he has the men. But why choose winter? I mean, why look at a Montana blizzard and think, yes, this is to my advantage? What was he seeing that a layman wouldn't?
Sheridan favored winter campaigns as a point of core military doctrine. His underlying logic, which he had tested with varying degrees of success in earlier campaigns further south, was that severe weather and deep snow would completely immobilize the Native American camps.
He assumes the snow traps them.
Exactly. A nomadic tribe's greatest advantage is mobility. They know the terrain, they move light, and they can vanish. Sheridan believed that a harsh plains winter would strip them of that advantage. They would be forced to hunker down in permanent winter villages to survive, essentially turning them into large stationary targets for his troops.
It's an interesting theory on paper, I guess, but it feels like a massive biological and logistical oversight. I mean, he's assuming his own troops, dragging heavy supply wagons, won't be equally or even more immobilized by that exact same weather.
It was a profound miscalculation of how adaptation works versus how a rigid logistics chain functions.
Yeah.
On February 8, 1876, barely a week after the political ultimatum deadline expired, Sheridan telegraphed his subordinate generals, Terry and Crook, ordering them to immediately begin winter operations.
Go get 'em, boys. The snow is our weapon.
But the snow wasn't their weapon, was it? It was a brick wall.
Is an unmitigated disaster for the Army. The initial winter thrust failed completely. General Crook mobilized his troops out of Fort Fetterman in Wyoming and marched straight into the freezing reality of the plains.
Oh, man.
His men suffered horrendously from bitter cold. Frostbite was rampant. They outpaced their supply lines and suffered from starvation.
Because you can't just forage for an entire cavalry regiment in 3 feet of snow. Exactly. And this just brings up a critical biological and logistical difference. Native American ponies were biologically adapted to the plains. They knew how to paw through the deep snow to reach the winter grasses underneath.
Right.
They could survive, albeit leanly, on the land. United States cavalry horses were larger grain-fed animals. If the Army's supply wagons full of grain got stuck in a snowdrift, the cavalry horses simply starved to death or froze.
It's like trying to run a heavy steam locomotive without laying the tracks first. You have all this power and momentum, but the second it hits the deep snow, the sheer weight of your own machine becomes the thing that dooms you.
And that doom materialized quickly. In March of 1876, Crook's freezing, starving column attempted an attack on a Cheyenne village on the Powder River.
How did that go?
The attack was completely botched. The Army was disorganized, the elements were too severe, and Crook was ultimately forced to abandon the effort and retreat back to his forts.
Think about the psychological impact of that early failure on the War Department. I mean, they engineer this entire war in a boardroom, they set a cynical winter deadline, they shift the paperwork, they order the attack, and their very first aggressive move results in their soldiers retreating due to starvation and frostbite.
The bureaucratic machine had just failed its first real-world stress test. They engineered a war, and they stumbled right out of the gate, proving that Chicago's assumptions did not match Montana's reality.
So Sheridan is sitting back in Chicago. He has a massive logistical failure on his hands. He realizes he cannot rely on the winter weather to do his fighting for him.
Right.
The Native Americans are perfectly capable of surviving the winter, but his grain-fed army is not. He has to go back to the drawing board. And this leads him to orchestrate a massive, complex, and, as we will see, fatally flawed escalation in the spring.
Following the humiliation of the winter failure, Sheridan pivoted entirely. He prepared a massive spring campaign. The new strategy was ambitious. He wanted to converge on the unceded region from 3 different directions simultaneously. The goal was to cast a massive net across the plains, trap the Indian bands between these 3 advancing columns, and crush them or drive them back to the reservations.
It's a classic pincer movement, but executed on a staggering macro scale. We are talking about coordinating movements across hundreds of miles. Let's break down these 3 columns because the sheer logistics of putting these men into the field is incredible.
The first prong of the attack was the Dakota column. This force was commanded by Brigadier General Alfred Terry, and they marched west out of Fort Abraham Lincoln in the Dakota Territory.
Okay, that's Terry.
Right. Terry had a substantial force of about 1,200 men, including infantry, cavalry, and a massive wagon train for supplies.
And this column is historically vital because it includes the infamous 7th Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer.
Yes.
But your notes emphasize something fascinating here. We really need to pause and look at the context surrounding Custer, because it ties right back to the boardroom politics we discussed at the start. Custer almost didn't make it to this campaign at all.
That's right. Custer was originally slated by the military brass to command this entire 1,200-man Dakota column. But President Grant personally intervened and stripped Custer of that overall command.
Why would the president involve himself in the assignment of a lieutenant colonel?
Because of the Belknap scandal.
Ah, right.
Custer, who was never shy about seeking the spotlight, had traveled to Washington, D.C., and provided highly damaging, publicized congressional testimony regarding Secretary of War Belknap's traitorship kickbacks.
Oh, wow.
Custer's testimony embarrassed the administration and deeply infuriated President Grant. As a punitive measure, Grant benched him.
It's a perfect, tangible example of how political maneuvering and ego in Washington directly degraded military readiness on the frontier.
Yeah.
You have a seasoned combat commander benched because he embarrassed the president's corrupt friend. So how does Custer end up at the Little Bighorn if Grant benched him?
He only made it into the field because General Terry, who was given the command instead, directly interceded with the president on Custer's behalf. Terry essentially had to beg Grant to let Custer come along, arguing he needed Custer's cavalry experience. Grant relented, but only allowed Custer to lead his specific regiment, the 7th Cavalry, not the entire column.
Yeah.
So I want you to put yourself in Custer's boots for a second. You are a famously ambitious, prideful officer. You have just been publicly humiliated by the President of the United States. You have been stripped of your overall command.
Right.
You are only allowed in the field because your superior officer begged for you. You are marching out into the plains, desperate, absolutely desperate to redeem your reputation with a massive headline-grabbing victory. Keep that psychological powder keg in mind.
It's crucial context.
Okay, so that is the Dakota column coming from the east. What are the other two prongs of Sheridan's trap?
The second prong is the Wyoming column. This force was commanded by General George Crook, who was marching north from Fort Fetterman with a powerful force of over 1,000 men. Crook, remember, is also trying to redeem his reputation after his humiliating retreat in the snow just a few months prior.
And the third prong, the Montana column. Commanded by Colonel John Gibbon, marching east from Fort Ellis. This was a smaller force, about 400 infantry and cavalry soldiers.
So Sheridan has Terry pushing west from the Dakotas, Crook pushing north from Wyoming, and Gibbon pushing east from Montana. You have almost 3,000 armed men converging on a massive, largely unmapped expanse of territory.
Yep.
On paper, sitting in Chicago, it sounds like a beautifully choreographed ballet of military might. But the sources highlight a glaring, almost unbelievable flaw in Sheridan's management of this ballet.
And this is exactly where the rigid command structure breaks down into absolute negligence. Because no one in the War Department knew exactly where the Native American encampments were located within this massive territory. Sheridan made a fateful decision. He did not give any specific tactical instructions to his department commanders regarding how they should coordinate once they were in the field.
Wait, I have to push back on this because it defies logic. Sheridan orchestrates this incredibly complex, synchronized, three-pronged attack, spanning hundreds of miles, requiring massive logistical trains. But then explicitly tells his generals he won't give them instructions on how to close the trap.
Yeah.
How do you coordinate a pincer movement if everyone is told to just figure it out themselves?
It is a massive contradiction, and it stems from Sheridan's fundamental misunderstanding of the terrain and the enemy. Sheridan's stated belief, documented in his correspondence, was that it would be unwise to make any combinations in such a country. He explicitly expected that each individual column should be able to take care of itself.
Take care of itself. That is staggering coming from the theater commander. He essentially builds this massive machine, points all three columns toward the middle of the map, and says, "Good luck. Let me know when you win."
What is truly fascinating here is the sheer disparity between the incredible logistical effort required to get these thousands of men equipped, fed, and marched into the field, and the complete, utter lack of coordinated tactical oversight once they actually deployed. Sheridan built the trap, but he refused to design a trigger. He walked away from the controls.
He is treating these massive columns like they are independent hunting parties wandering the woods. But they aren't. They are supposed to be an interlocking net. And because there is no central tactical control, because there is no one forcing them to synchronize, the net begins to tear before the main forces even get close to each other.
Exactly. And the first major catastrophic tear in the plan happens without Terry or Gibbon even knowing about it.
Oh, man.
On June 17, 1876, General Crook's massive Wyoming column, pushing north, was suddenly attacked by a large Native American force led by Crazy Horse at the Battle of the Rosebud.
This isn't just a skirmish. This is a massive, hours-long engagement.
It was one of the largest battles of the Indian Wars. Crazy Horse utilized brilliant, unprecedented swarm tactics that caught Crook completely off guard. He fought Crook's 1,000-man army to an absolute standstill.
Wow.
Crook sustained casualties, expended a massive, irreplaceable amount of his ammunition, and realized with horror that he was facing a unified Native American force that was much larger and vastly more aggressive than anything Chicago had predicted.
And what does Crook do when he realizes the script has flipped?
He falls back. Crook retreated south to a supply base to lick his wounds and await reinforcements, effectively knocking his entire column out of the campaign.
Just like that, one full third of Sheridan's grand trap is broken. The southern door of the cage is left wide open. But the true tragedy here, the logistical nightmare of the 1870s, is the communication vacuum. Because there are no telegraph lines reaching out into the remote plains of Montana, Terry and Gibbon have absolutely zero idea that Crook has been neutralized.
The sheer geography and the limits of 19th century communication technology created massive, fatal blind spots. Terry and Gibbon are operating under the firm assumption that Crook is still aggressively pushing north, driving the Native American bands right toward them.
They're acting on phantom intelligence. They are trying to close a trap that is already fundamentally broken. Oblivious to Crook's defeat, Terry and Gibbon continue to converge on the Yellowstone River, and they are about to meet and formulate their own localized trap, placing an enormous, unprecedented amount of trust in a subordinate Custer who, as we established, is burning with a desperate need to prove himself.
Which brings us to a crucial, highly dramatized meeting on June 21st, 1876. General Terry, Colonel Gibbon, and Lieutenant Colonel Custer all met aboard the supply steamboat Far West.
I love this historical detail from your notes. They are holding a council of war on a steamboat. It is moored at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Rosebud rivers. Just picture this. It's this heavy, coal-burning piece of industrial machinery pushed deep into the pristine wilderness, serving as a floating military headquarters. It perfectly encapsulates the clash of worlds we are talking about. The men of the machine are planning how to conquer the men of the plains.
Aboard the Far West, General Terry, who firmly believed they were finally closing in on Sitting Bull's main village, devised his own localized pincer movement to trap the Indians between his forces and Gibbon's forces.
Because remember, in Terry's mind, Crook is still out there somewhere blocking the South, so Terry looks at the map on the table of the steamboat and says, okay, Gibbon and I will take the slower infantry and form one arm of the trap, and Custer, you take the fast-moving 7th Cavalry and form the other arm.
According to Terry's explicit written orders, which were issued to Custer the next day on June 22, the plan was highly specific in its geography, but fatally ambiguous in its command directives.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, Custer was ordered to take his entire 7th Cavalry Regiment and march south, up the Rosebud River, in active pursuit of a large Indian trail their scouts had discovered.
So Terry wants Custer to swing wide to the south.
Yes. Crucially, Terry's written orders indicated he wanted Custer to continue marching south, perhaps going as far as the headwaters of the Tongue River, even if he found that the main Indian trail turned sharply west toward the Little Bighorn River.
Okay, let's unpack the strategic logic of this southern sweep, because if you just look at a map, it seems counterintuitive. Why is Terry asking Custer to march away from the trail if he sees it turning toward the enemy?
It was entirely about timing and containment. This wide southern sweep was designed to block the Native Americans from escaping to the south or east. But more importantly, it was about matching speeds.
Speeds, right.
Custer's cavalry on horseback was incredibly fast. Terry and Gibbon's column included much slower marching infantry. Terry needed to artificially slow Custer down. He needed Custer to take the long way around to buy time for the slower infantry column to march up the Bighorn River.
Ah, I see.
The goal was for both columns to jointly arrive at the village and trap it simultaneously on a specific agreed-upon date, June 26.
It's a beautifully timed textbook maneuver. Custer swings south, blocks the back door, and waits. Terry and Gibbon march up the front door. On June 26, the anvil meets the hammer, and they squeeze.
That was the tactical intention. But Terry, perhaps hampered by his own gentlemanly nature, made a critical historical error in how he communicated this order to Custer. In the official written document, Terry explicitly gave Custer a fatal loophole.
The famous leeway clause.
Exactly. Terry wrote that while he had a clear, coordinated plan, he did not wish to impose upon you precise orders which might hamper your action when nearly in contact with the enemy.
So what does this actually mean in military terms? Terry is basically giving Custer the guidelines, or more what you'd call actual rule speech.
Yeah.
He's trying to be a polite, deferential commander. He understands that a cavalry pursuit is dynamic, and he wants to respect his field commander's judgment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the personalities involved, we are witnessing a tragic clash of leadership styles. You have General Terry, an officer who values flexibility, who trusts his subordinates, and who leads by consensus, writing an order to George Custer, a man internationally known for his aggressive, borderline reckless, glory-seeking nature.
Especially a Custer who is a wounded animal right now.
Yep.
He has just been publicly humiliated by President Grant, stripped of his larger command, and is desperately looking for a massive, solo, headline-grabbing victory to shove back in the politicians' faces. Terry politely gives him an inch of tactical leeway, and Custer drives his entire regiment right through it.
And that is exactly how history unfolded. Upon marching out and discovering that the Indian Trail indeed turned west toward the valley of the Little Bighorn, Custer made his choice. He did not continue south, as Terry suggested.
He completely ignores it.
He ignored the sweeping containment maneuver. He ignored the need to wait for the infantry. He ignored the June 26 timeline. He followed the trail immediately and aggressively.
He sees the trail, he smells the victory, and he takes it. He doesn't wait to act as the anvil. He wants to be the hammer. He goes straight for the target.
Disregarding Terry's coordinated dual-column plan, Custer pushed his men and horses to the brink of exhaustion and attacked the massive encampment early on the morning of June 25.
A full day before Terry and Gibbon's infantry were supposed to be in position to support him.
This unilateral, ego-driven decision completely shattered the coordinated pincer movement. Custer attacked an encampment that was vastly larger and more heavily defended than his scouts anticipated.
Yeah.
He did it without the support of the other columns, and he did it against an enemy that, just a week prior, had fought General Crook to a standstill. The result was the complete, shocking annihilation of his immediate command.
The bureaucratic machine that started in Washington, D.C. completely broke down at the very last mile in Montana. It is a stunning cascade of institutional failures.
It really is, when you view it from a macro perspective based on your notes. You have Sheridan's complete lack of overall tactical coordination from Chicago, which forced Terry to improvise a complex plan in the field without knowing Crook was defeated.
Right.
And then you have Terry's ambiguous, overly polite phrasing in his written orders, which provided Custer with the exact bureaucratic justification he needed to act independently and aggressively.
This was never just a story about a single battle. It wasn't just a story about a bad tactical maneuver on a grassy hill in Montana. It is a story about the failures of a complex, arrogant system.
We started with a political pretext for land. The Black Hills Gold Rush, thinly disguised as logistical winter deadline. That unrealistic, impossible policy was handed to a War Department that was currently reeling and paralyzed by a massive kickback scandal at the very top of its leadership.
Then that policy goes to a distant headquarters in a Chicago high-rise, where a theater commander fundamentally misunderstands the harsh biological realities of a plains winter, resulting in starvation, frostbite, and an initial humiliating retreat.
Which then leads to a massive, disjointed, desperate, three-pronged spring campaign, where the general in charge explicitly refuses to coordinate his own forces, allowing a third of his army to be quietly defeated without the others even knowing.
And it ultimately culminates on a steamboat in the wilderness, with a gentleman general giving a desperate, politically humiliated subordinate just enough ambiguous language in a memo to hang himself with.
It is a powerful historical reminder of how relevant these organizational mechanics are today. In any complex organization, whether it's a modern military deployment, a massive multinational corporation, or a sprawling government agency, communication vacuums are deadly.
When top leadership provides ambiguous directives, when they design massive strategies in comfortable rooms without understanding the brutal conditions on the ground, and when they allow ego and corruption to dictate logistics, it is always the people executing those plans at the lowest level, the soldiers in the snow who suffer the ultimate consequences.
The failure at the Little Bighorn wasn't just a failure of cavalry tactics. It was a total failure of organizational management. The structure collapsed under the immense weight of its own disconnected, arrogant hierarchy.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we wrap up this topic. Think deeply about Terry's polite leeway clause in those final written orders handed to Custer on the deck of the Far West. I do not wish to impose upon you precise orders which might hamper your action. If a manager or a commander values flexibility over rigidity, they are inherently gambling on the judgment, the temperament, and the ego of their subordinates. It makes you wonder, when you look back at other massive events in your history books, how much of it hasn't actually been shaped by grand strategy or brilliant battlefield tactics, but simply by the ambiguous phrasing of an email or a memo? How many disasters happen just because someone, trying to be polite, left exactly enough room in the paperwork for human ego to take the wheel? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive and sharing your notes with us. Keep questioning the sources, keep looking past the obvious narratives to see the machinery underneath, and we will see you next time.